Thank you so much, and good morning, everybody. I was told that this is your first presentation in English, and that I will have the honor to give you some facts and figures on how to make culture work for you in 20 minutes. The presentation, I believe, will be shared with you. There are going to be a lot of facts and figures, so you might feel a little bit overwhelmed. But on that disclaimer, I shall start my speech. So, if we talk about culture, it's important to realize we all have an opinion on it. And the question is that opinion the same as knowledge? Because culture is a concept that attracts a lot of discussion, but how much of that discussion is fact-based? So, in order to have a fact-based discussion, it's important to understand what is culture actually about. And I would like you, therefore, to think for yourself for a moment and tell your neighbor, what is it that you think you see? What do you see in the picture in front of you? And assuming you have had some time to think about this, many of you, to all likelihood, would say this is a frog. But is it? Because if you would now collectively tilt your head to your right shoulder this way around, and you look upside down from the top to the bottom, the eyes of the frog becomes the nose or the nostrils of a horse. The hind legs of the frog become the ears of the horse, and the fluffy stuff in the blue background could be seen as the hair of a horse. The message here is, when we show images, when we show behavior, when we use certain words, we assume quite often that people will understand the same thing. But in reality, quite often this is not the case. And this is where culture comes in as a definition. Culture is about how do we codify, how do we program groups of people to think in a way that we want them to think like. And inside organizations, this means that it would be kind of useful if, when we work in the same company, we talk the same language. But do we really? If you work in HR, do you really understand software coders or production people? If you are a manager, do you think that the workforce thinks in exactly the same way and will understand the ways you use, the words you use? So facts and figures matter in order for us to make sure that we actually, on a day-to-day basis, speak the same language and behave in a way that we mutually understand in the same way. Because if we do not, the risk is that projects get delayed for 3 to 4 months. And this is not because of a lack of competency of people involved. It's just that for 3 months, one of us might thought we were talking about a frog. And for those same 3 months, the other person always thought we were talking about a horse. If you use a word like innovation, if you use a word like agility, if you use words like courage, what do they really mean? What is the behavioral expectation behind those words? If we get that wrong because we make assumptions on a mutual understanding, which might not be there, we stand to have higher risk of involuntary attrition, people leaving, higher risk of sick leave percentages being higher than average. If, however, we take the time to really make sure that the words we use are understood and systems and structures are built to reinforce a unified, consistent message, we can get a return to market that is 400% greater. So it pays off to make sure culture is not based on assumptions, but based on facts and figures. Now, when we talk about culture from a working life perspective, we talk about the way in which we work, working practices. And when we talk about working practices, there are a couple of components. Now, many of you would have done or are doing satisfaction surveys. But here is an unfortunate fact. Happy employees do not prevent bankruptcy. They need to be engaged. They need to work in a way that makes sense strategically, meaning they need to work in a way that helps to execute your strategy. And if retention is important, you want to make sure they work in a way that is economically and emotionally sustainable. And I will come back at this latter part, the emotional sustainability, because in data from Turkey, there we have found some interesting facts and figures that could be useful to take into account. In preparing today's speech, I was asked to talk a little bit about the word optimal culture. You see the word cultural optimization. Often when we talk about corporate culture, the risk is that we talk about fantasy land. The risk is that we would talk about the way we would like to be. An example is companies saying we want to have an open culture. Nice. But is it effective? When you work in cybersecurity, do you really want to have an open culture? If you work in auditing or compliance, do you really want to have an innovation-driven culture? Culture is a management tool, and the best way to use it is to wield it in a way that supports you to execute your strategy, taking into account reality, meaning if there is tough economical times, there are things you cannot do. If there is a change in management, it will impact people's feelings of security. So cultural optimization, setting an optimal way of working, is not about wishful thinking. We would like to be this way. It is about a conscious decision. We need to be this way. So when we talk about data from our global research relevant to Turkey, a couple of things to keep in mind. One of them is Turkish national culture. And if we compare Turkey with some of your major trading partners, in this case, the US and Germany, you can already very quickly see there are some innate differences between the cultures. Turkey is a bit more hierarchical, a bit more top-down. Nothing worse or better with that, it's just what it is, but it is different compared to stakeholders outside Turkey. Turkey is a bit more relationship focused, and that has ups and downs. The up is when you have trust, things move really fast. The potential downside is if you're outside that circle of trust, no matter how competent you are still outside that circle, so things might get delayed. National culture and understanding what drives a nation, understanding what drives people, is critical to make sure that the way in which you manage your business is emotionally sustainable. If you have been educated abroad in an Anglo-Saxon management program, the likelihood is that you have been taught Anglo-Saxon management philosophies, management by objectives. Fantastic. But does that really work in Turkey? Does it really work if people feel that all they are there for is output, and that family relationship part is less important? And this is when we go back to that word, optimal culture. What is it that you need? What is it that you have? What is it that you would like to have? Different components. This is the analytical background of the global research we did 2 years ago. We do researches like this based on our global data every year. And data from the Turkey and region is based on roughly 1,200 respondents, so a relatively okay sample size. Questions we ask is, for example, what is more important in your day-to-day work? The process or the goal? Now, when you work in sales, typically the answer would obviously be goal, close the deal. But when you work in compliance or quality control, the process must be followed. And again, there's no question of better or worse. It's just a question of, do you then align this with one another? And do you talk about why it needs to be one way over the other way? If we look at Turkey, what we can see is that it scores quite purple compared to some other countries. And that means that employees want to have a much more goal-oriented culture compared to what management enables them to have. So if process is important in your organization, but you're not sufficiently clear on what are the priorities, there is a risk for a mismatch, meaning people are told to follow the process without understanding why is it necessary. Now, if you want to keep people engaged, reflecting on clear prioritization, this is our focus point for the coming months, will help your business to thrive sooner and faster. Another question is, when you make products or services, do you know what is best for the customer? Or do you engage a lot with your customer and do you customize deliverables? Turkey has indicated that people in Turkey, working in Turkey, wish to have less customer orientation, which is interesting. Could that be because on the one hand, they're told to follow the process, and on the other hand, they're told do what the customer wants? So which one is more important? Then if we talk about the question, is the customer always right? This is where you can basically see that what people experience, follow the rules, versus what managers say, follow the customer, creates a paradox. So as a manager, the question is really important. If we need to follow a process, therefore we cannot tell customers that we need to adjust, are we consistent in our internal messaging or not? And that brings us to another question. What is better, a brand new solution or a perfectly executed old process? So when do we deviate, if we deviate? If we look at Turkey, what people wish, employees wish, is that they are cut some slack. They are being controlled less. And that typically means that they are being controlled too much. What people experience is stick to the rule. What people would like is have a little bit of breathing space. So if we go back to the paradox, employees in Turkey want to have more focus on the output, on the goal. So they want to drive, they're really motivated to perform. But they want to have clarity on which rules to follow and when can they have some flexibility. Whereas what management says is follow the rules, or follow the process, listen to the customer, but stick to the process. So what is it going to be? The process or the customer? So this is one paradox that we have found in our data from Turkey with regards to what people experience. If we talk about talent management, an important question is, who are we loyal to? If we're loyal to our job, meaning we are the best professional ever, the talent management challenge is, can you as an organization always enable people to be having enough challenges to test their skills? If your business is very repetitive and you invest a lot in talent development, so you make people smarter and more competent, are you actually giving them the space to test that knowledge? Or are they supposed to stick to the process? But if they are supposed to stick to the process, then why are they developing their skills? So that is, again, another paradox. Because what we see in Turkey is that people actually feel too much loyalty is demanded towards their direct boss, not the organization at large, but to their direct boss. This is basically how that looks like in numerical terms. So what people experience is you need to be loyal to your boss. What people wish and what organizations also want is, look, you need to be loyal to your job / the organization. So we have a paradox. That is reinforced with a practice of openness and approachability? How open does information flow? How quickly do people feel at home inside an organization? In organizations that are more closed, typically how you will recognize this is when people say, how long have you worked here? I'm quite new. I've been here for 5 years. That means it's a closed organization, because if it takes you 5 years to feel at home, that's quite a long time. If we look at Turkey, what people want is a more open discussion culture at the work floor. So this is not as expressive as perhaps here in the Nordics or in the Anglo-Saxon world, but definitely people want to have a bit more openness. Management also says, yes, that's okay, but with a certain limit. So there is a similar understanding that people would want to have a bit more openness and transparency, but maybe are struggling with what is the structure needed to enable this. Because that comes back to our final statement, which is, when you think about work life, does your job define you? Do you work to live? Or do you live to work? Here we can see a very strong indication from Turkish employees that they want to have more work-life balance. And this is also corresponding with what we see globally, especially younger generations want to have more work-life balance. And here the gap is quite massive. So employees want to have much more of this, much more proactive management, asking, checking in, hey, how are you doing? How's the family doing? It gives people a safety feeling, a feeling of belonging, and that enhances employee engagement and therefore productivity. But the question is, are managers equipped to provide this role? Because what we see, to summarize the second part, is employees want to have more space for professional development. Organizations also say, yes, this is important, but it's often too busy. So the core question is, are you going to create time for people to keep developing and therefore enable the organization to develop? Or will it always be too busy because people are being too busy? So when do people block the time, literally block 2 hours a week, for example, to learn and to deploy the learning so that you can create collective learning in the organization? And this is something that needs to be designed in the way organizations are managed and also structured. So to summarize, within 20 minutes, the biggest perception gaps in Turkey, therefore the things you really want to talk about in order to give people a feeling that, hey, we got you, we understand you, let's discuss a constructive way forward, are people experience too much process orientation without understanding why. So if you cannot change the process, at least explain why it is important. People experience that too much loyalty is demanded towards a direct unit boss or team lead, whereas both the organizations and employees want to have loyalty more at a broader organizational level. People have a feeling that work life is not transparent enough, and this brings us back to that first observation. When people understand why choices are being made, it often cases helps to avoid resistance to those choices, meaning things can go faster. And last but not least, and that's a very important attention point from a learning and development, talent management point of view, if you invest a lot in developing people, but you do not enable them to deploy those learnings because it is too busy, then forever you will be too busy. So it takes time to create time. Once you have created time, you are able to save time. And on that paradox, I'm going to stop basically for questions and answers. If you want to know more about this, we have a lot of open enrollment programs that you can also find on our website that basically come regularly on a bi-monthly interval. But on that note, I think my 20 minutes is up with 20 seconds to spare. So we are on time. That means we have created 20 extra seconds for questions and answers. So I'll give it back to the moderator to facilitate that.
var. Mikrofon geliyor. Yes, we have one question. Oktay Bey, tekrar el kaldırabilir misiniz?
First of all, thank you very much for your comprehensive speech about Turkey. It's a very, very valuable remarks that you made about Turkey from outside. As a person from outside, thank you very much. You talk about the culture, role of culture in a company, in a working environment, and its effect on the employees and employer. My question is a little bit about the leadership. Can you please elaborate a little bit on the role of leaders to provide that kind of positive working environment that you mentioned? For example, if the leader is goal oriented, then the employees may or might be the goal oriented. Okay, you understand what I mean, I believe. Thank you so much.
So, if you reflect on the role of leadership, one very important reflection is not only what do leaders do, and not only what do leaders say, but also what is it that they do not talk about. A very concrete example is globally, including in Turkey, we know that the younger generations, so the millennials and the Gen Z, as the youngest ones are called, find life a lot more insecure, and they need a lot more guidance. They have typically higher burnout and sick leave ratios. But then if you think about the role that leaders play in this, to which extent do leaders show vulnerability? To which extent do leaders talk about the fact that, hey, it is okay to not feel okay? Of course, not the whole time. It's not a social workplace. It's not a care house. Business needs to be made. But when leaders showcase that vulnerability, indicating that, hey, it is okay to not feel okay. It is okay to feel a lot of stress. If you have young children, if your parents get old and they need more support, this will impact people's brain and the motivation to take the work. And when they know that leaders know this, and they know this by talking about this, you can help to normalize discussions that can help to engage and keep people motivated, even when there is, for example, a lot of work pressure. So leadership, I would say, plays an outweighted role, an extremely important role. And therefore, that consciousness, we call this cultural executive ownership, knowing what is the consequence of your behavior, and that includes what you do and do not do, is crucial, in my opinion, for every single leader.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else? Kürşat Bey'de mikrofon.
I'm surprised that on a presentation regarding culture, you haven't mentioned famous dictum, culture eats breakfast. Culture eats strategy for breakfast.
Thank you.
Yeah, my question is, what would your comments be on passage of time, on the time aspect of changes to the culture. I mean, from 1950s onwards, the world economy was mostly based on industrial production, and then service became more important factor, and then we had the transformation in information technologies. Now we are talking about transformations, and this also changes how people live their lives in society, in economy. Globalization in the 90s, globalization was all the rage. Now we are talking about more local dynamics taking place. So how would you put culture in in all these developments that took place in the last 6 or 7 decades?
Very good question. I have indeed not mentioned that culture eats strategy for breakfast, because I did figure that most of you would have probably known this statement. But it also is to state that you're not running a business for culture. You're running a business to make a profit. And in our approach to culture, culture is nothing more and nothing less than a tool of management. So if you have a great culture, but you have a bad business plan or a bad product, culture is not going to help you. So culture is a tool that needs to support the execution of a strategy, whether you do products or services. And it is the thing that helps you to distinguish your organization from the competition. So that's why I didn't put too much focus on the strategy and breakfast and lunch and dinner part. On your question regarding changes, first of all, culture is multi-layered. So yes, we can see people using similar information technology, similar social media. So on the surface, it looks like people are more connected. But what is the motivation behind using social media? Are we using social media to show off? Are we using social media to stay connected? Are we using social media because we feel lonely? So when we stay at a surface level and we don't understand or dive deeper behind that surface level, then you could say, yes, we're doing more of the same. So are we becoming more of the same? The reality is, however, the exact opposite. The more we get exposed globally to different ways of doing things, the more we get scared. The more we go back to basic, and you will see this in every single country. Countries have become more nationalistic, because when you get confronted with things that are different, you go back to what feels safe. And what feels safe is what you were raised up with. So we actually see cultures mostly becoming much stronger, different than they used to be in the past. So there's more polarization. That's one thing. The other thing, what you could see is that the moment there is more institutionalization, so if you take countries like Portugal or Greece that have been going through a lot of restructuring economically, it changes the culture. So every country that is going through big shocks, economical challenges, they will become more local than they used to be, because again, that same psychological mechanism, when confronted with challenges, we go back to what we know. So globally, more polarization. And for organizations, that basically is linked back to what I mentioned, that the younger generation needs more security mentally, not just physically. And managers tend to not be necessarily equipped with this, because managers will be asking themselves the question, am I a manager, a psychotherapist, or your father or mother? And that's a difficult balance to strike. And this is something that we see around the globe, not just in Turkey, but in pretty much most of the countries where we have data, that role, that separation between work life and private life is blurring a little bit, and that managers really struggle with the emotional and psychological needs of the workforce. Very good question, therefore a somewhat longer answer.
Evet, başka soru var mı? Son bir sorumuz olacak. Bir tane el görüyorum orada. Mr. Schram, we have one last question.
Hello, thank you, Schram, for your speech. You started your speech with the picture depicting that there is an actual current culture of organization, there is a desired culture for the organization, and to effectively apply our strategy in our organization, we try to fill the gap between the desired and current culture with the cultural optimization. I am working, I am a part of a transformation team in SoftTech company. So we do culture assessment in organizations. We depict the picture of the organization current culture, but we start the picture with the individual beliefs, thoughts, values. We start the picture with the not current culture, but the individual first. As we are today with a crowd full of recruitment specialists here from defense sector in Turkey, in recruitment processes, what do you think that we should we start the individuals with values, giving more values, approaching to our organizational values? So we start the values of individuals that are approaching our organizational values to have the desired organizational culture. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. I would say the first reflection is on what is a value. And a statement we often make in our certification courses is that organizations, and the crowd will probably be shocked by what I am about to say, so be prepared. Organizations do not have values. Organizations are not emotional entities. People are. People have emotional preferences, and that is what we call values. Organizations have, in our opinion, no right to tell employees this is what you must value. But what organizations can do and should do is say this is the behavior we expect. In other words, you have a purpose as an organization, you have beliefs as an organization with regards to how you want to reach and execute that purpose. So you make choices on what are the behaviors we accept, what are the behaviors that we do not accept. What people feel about those behaviors should not be relevant necessarily unless you find it difficult to attract people and keep people, in which case you want to pay more attention to people's emotional reflection on that behavioral component that you have described. So when it comes to recruitment, a lot of practices are built around assessing individuals, but who of us really works alone? So we would argue that if you want to enable people to fit better to the way of working in a team, there are two things that are important. Understand, number one, how does the team actually work? And number two, understand the emotional preferences inside that team, so that when you match that with an applicant who you could test on this as well, you get a better understanding of if this team works in a very agile, bottom-up way, but this recruitee needs more guidance. Are we then the right team if we are not equipped to provide that guidance? And if as a team we are not, but we still want that individual, is there somebody in our team which has a bit more natural affinity with providing this top-down guidance? So to summarize on a very good question, because we consider values emotional preferences, our belief is that companies do not have values. Companies have purpose statements, and they should have behavioral expectations that people can sign up to. And if your behavioral expectation is you accept, for example, in the defense industry and defense in general, you know it's a bit more top-down. You know it's hierarchical. So if you don't accept hierarchy, don't apply. Unless there is a part of the unit or the industry that needs more independence. So special forces, for example, they are looking for people that show independence, counter to what the army at large is looking for. And it's the same in any organization. Some parts of the organization, by nature of the function, need to be a bit more top-down. So then don't recruit people that don't accept that, because then you're up for problems. So that's basically our perspective on your question, which is understand the unit into which you are planning to recruit somebody, ensure that the way of working is aligned with the expectation, and understand that the emotional connection might be very important.
Okay, thank you. Our time is running out. We would like to thank Mr. Schram and thank you for this valuable presentation.
Thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your day. Bye-bye.